Greetings, this is the Cancer Interviews Podcast. I'm your host, Bruce Morton. Our guest on this episode is a warrior. Laurie Adami of Los Angeles, California, endured all manner of treatments covering 12 years, but she survived stage 4 follicular non-Hodgkin lymphoma. She continues to carry on the fight against this disease as an advocate on the personal and legislative levels. Now it's time to hear her inspiring story. And Laurie, welcome to Cancer Interviews.
Thank you, Bruce, and good morning.
Good morning. And before we start, we'd like to learn a little bit more about you. So if you would, tell us a bit about where you're from, what you've done for work, and what you like to do for fun.
Sure. I was born on the Northeast and grew up in Connecticut, New Jersey, upstate New York, and the Boston area. And I was working in Boston at a bank when I was 24 years old, and I got recruited to join a small startup software company in Los Angeles. So in 1984, I packed up my crummy little car and I drove west and ended up working for 24 years for this company that ended up going public, and I ended up becoming president of the firm in 1998 when the founder decided it was time for him to move on to other businesses. So from 1998, I became the president and did a lot of traveling, over 3 million miles on American Airlines over my 24-year career. And in 1998, the same year I became president of the firm, I was married. And 2 years later, in 2000, I had my son, at which point I was 40 years old. So I was one of those older moms, and had my little boy in the year 2000.
And for fun, what do you like to do when you're not on a plane?
I love to cook. I love to exercise. I love to hike. I love to swim laps. I'm a big puzzle fanatic. So every day, New York Times, crossword puzzles, Wordle, connections, all of it. Love to do jigsaw puzzles. Always have a jigsaw going. Keeps me a little sane when I need a break from the world. And I love to travel. So I'm doing quite a lot of travel right now because I'm doing a lot of public speaking, sort of inspirational speaking about my journey.
Laurie, and let's talk about your journey. For all of us who have survived cancer, there was that time in which we thought our health was normal until it wasn't. What happened to you that resulted in your seeking medical attention?
In around 2003, I started to get frequent sinus infections. So at this point, I'm still working, still running my company, still traveling. My little boy's 3, and I would get these chronic sinus infections that would last for months. I also noticed that I had a lymph node in my neck, which was dismissed by the doctors because they said, well, that's because you keep getting sinus infections. And I had a very dry eye. I was a long-time contact lens wearer and very, very dry eye. And the doctor said, oh, it's your hormones. You're mid-40s. This is very common for women. And the last thing I noticed was I had a lump in my abdomen. And the doctors felt it and said, oh, it's just a hernia. Don't worry about it. I mean, I was roundly dismissed and I felt horrible. The worst thing was the extreme fatigue that I had. And the doctors would say, well, Laurie, you're running a software company. You're traveling every month for at least a week, either to Europe or to the East Coast. You're running a household. My husband also has a business, so he was busy with his business. You're taking care of a little kid. I was juggling a lot. He said, I'm just exhausted listening to you. And I said, yes, but this is a whole different exhaustion. But I got roundly dismissed for almost 3 years.
By the way, we're confident you'll be able to learn some tips and tools to help you through your personal cancer journey. But first, we'd like to invite you to please give us a like, leave a comment or review below, and share this story with your friends. Kindly click on the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon. That way you'll be notified the next time we post an interview. And we want to remind you that on Cancer Interviews, we are not distributors of medical advice. If you seek medical advice, please consult a licensed healthcare professional. So, Laurie, you have been dismissed on a variety of levels when you've brought certain maladies to the attention of healthcare professionals, and yet there was a chain of events that led to your diagnosis. What was that chain of events?
I finally got rid of all the doctors I'd been seeing. I'd seen two ENTs, ear, nose, and throat specialists. I'd seen an allergist. I'd seen two different internists. I'd seen an immunologist. They all just dismissed my concerns. So I realized that I needed to find a good diagnostician who would listen to me and not dismiss me as some young, blonde, idiot woman, which was the way I was treated. And I had actually the wife of the founder of my company had told me about a new diagnostician she was seeing, and she recommended I get an appointment with this doctor and see if he would listen to me and figure it out. And in fact, that's what happened. So I got an appointment to see him and went in. He listened to all my concerns. He acknowledged that what I'd been told was, of course, a possibility. This could all be allergies leading to sinus infections, hormones leading to dry eyes, hernia leading to this mass in my abdomen. But he said, Laurie, we don't guess about this. This is why we have CT machines. I am sending you to see a hernia specialist. Actually, better yet, I'm going to get him on the phone right now. We're going to talk to him, and he's going to set up to get you a scan. So while I was in this internist's office, he got the hernia surgeon on the phone, and the hernia surgeon said, well, she doesn't need to see me. I'm going to order a CAT scan for this week. So I want her to go in and get this imaging done. And so it happened that fast. Once I got someone to listen to me, and I wasn't living in a rural setting. I was in Los Angeles. You would have thought, right? But that was not my experience, unfortunately. So I had that, and I was told that I would get the CT scan of this abdominal thing I was feeling, which was assumed to be a Spigelian hernia, and that it wouldn't take contrast. It would be really fast. I would be in and out in a half hour, all of that. So I went in, and they were also biopsying a couple little goiters they had seen on my thyroid that had been detected that they wanted to just check. So interestingly enough, I was really worried about the goiter, the thyroid, that I had thyroid cancer, and I was dismissing the abdomen as a hernia. But so I went in and they had imaged me first, and it was all at a big center, so they could do everything right at the same place. And then they were doing the biopsies, 2 biopsies of my thyroid. And I noticed this tech come into the room with these 2 bottles of white stuff, looked like white liquid. And I was told that the images that they had gotten were not clear enough and that I would have to drink contrast. And that was when my stomach first began to sink. And so I drank the contrast. They rolled me back in. They imaged me, and they said, they're still not good enough. We need to inject you with a contrast material. So by then it's pretty clear this was not a hernia, whatever this was in my abdomen. And so I left the office, pretty upset, not really understanding, but having a really bad feeling that what I had been experiencing for the last 3 years was actually some sort of a cancer, some sort of a malignancy.
And after the consumption of the contrast and the results that came therefrom, that's when you got your diagnosis?
Yes. So the hernia doctor's office had called to schedule me for an appointment the following week. And I was supposed to be leaving for Chicago and New York the following Monday. So I said, well, I'm going on a business trip. I'm going to have to, schedule it for when I'm back. We were having our big client conferences where I had to do keynote speeches and stuff. And I was just in this mode of business. And about a half hour later, the phone rang again, and it was the internist. And he said, you need to come in today. I need to talk to, or his office said, the doctor needs to see you today. And so I guess the surgeon had called the internist and said, she won't come in for 2 weeks. Maybe you can call her and get her to go in sooner. And that was Good Friday, 2006. I was now 46. My son was in kindergarten. And I went alone because nobody told me to bring anybody with me. So I went into the doctor's office that Friday, of Good Friday of 2006. And that was when he told me that I had a tumor in my abdomen that was the size of a small watermelon. And I also had, I had spots in my lung. So he actually speculated that I could have 2 different cancers, whatever was in my abdomen and then whatever was in my lungs. And he just dropped this bomb. And nobody ever expects to have that bomb dropped on their head. And you know, it's interesting. I've learned since that 40% of Americans will be diagnosed with some form of cancer during their lifetime. 40%. You know, maybe when they're 86, they'll develop prostate. But when it happens, excuse me, when it happens to you, you never expect it, and you don't have a clue what to do.
And you knew that you had a mammoth task ahead of you as you knew you would be undergoing treatment for this. But what you couldn't know at that time was that you were about to embark on a journey that covered 12 years and 7 different types of treatments. If you would, Laurie, go over the first 6 treatments, then we'll get to the 7th one a little bit later. But talk about the first 6 types of treatment, what they involved, and then what happened with each.
So when I was diagnosed 19 years ago now, in 2006, there was one approved treatment for someone who had the kind of disease bulk I had, which was very bulky, stage 4 follicular non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And that was a chemo and monoclonal antibody called R-CHOP. And it included Rituxan, which was a monoclonal antibody, and 3 different chemo agents, oncovine, adriamycin, or oncovine, vincristine, adriamycin, and cytoxin, plus prednisone. So, and that was what I had 4 opinions because I knew I needed to get more than one, not only on the pathology itself, but also on the treatment options. There were some trials at the time, but it was too early to know whether they would be effective. And so the advice from all 4 of these lymphoma specialists that I saw, not general oncologists, I went to lymphoma specialists, was that I needed to do R-CHOP. So I did 6 cycles every 3 weeks, and at the end of the 3rd cycle, they checked to see if the chemo and Rituxan were working, and they discovered that my disease had gone PET negative, which means the positron emission technology scanning I had had at the beginning that was lighting up like a Christmas tree was no longer lighting up. So they knew it was working, so we went on and had the remaining 3 cycles, a total of 6, and then I was imaged following on that. And I was told I was in complete remission. So what did I do? I went merrily back to work and I resumed my crazy life. Only now when I flew to London, I wore a mask because my oncologist told me, Laurie, you're still immune suppressed. You need to wear a mask on the plane. You need to use hand sanitizer, use wipes, wipe down the tray tables, the seat belts, everything. And I resumed my life. Just 4 months later, they did another follow-on scan, and I was at that point doing maintenance Rituxan. So once a quarter, I went in for the Rituxan monoclonal antibody treatment, and they felt that there was some data that showed it might keep me in remission. Sadly, that wasn't the case. And 4 months later, when I went in for the scan, I already had uptake in my lung. Oh, and by the way, the stuff in my lungs was not lung cancer. It was my lymphoma that had metastasized to my lung, which is a very strange presentation, which is why they were confused in the beginning, but it was all the same disease. So when I was imaged, my lungs were again lighting up. So I then watched the disease for about a year while I researched options, and I went all over the place. I had family in Boston, so I went to Boston to Dana-Farber to consult with the head of follicular lymphoma. I went to Stanford. I went to various places in LA. Everybody wanted to do an autologous stem cell transplant. And what they do with that is you get chemoed again with even harder chemo, and R-CHOP is considered pretty brute force. So then they would do ESHOP or RICE, something even more intense than R-CHOP, hopefully get me in remission. Then they would, we had already harvested my stem cell transplant, my stem cells that were in the bank at City of Hope in California, which is a big transplant place since the mid-70s. And so the hope was they would get me back in remission, they would give me my stem cell transplants, and I'd have a good remission. Well, I started to research, and the results were horrible for auto transplant follicular bulky disease. Over half the patients relapsed in under a year. And then you've gone through another brutal chemotherapy. And then I couldn't go in the hospital for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. I had a little kid at home. So I begged the guy at City of Hope to see if he could find me a trial. And at that point, I started my second treatment, which was an HDAC inhibitor that had been approved for T-cell lymphoma that was being trialed for B-cell, what's considered indolent B-cell lymphoma, which is what follicular is considered. So this was a phase 2 trial. It was already approved for another disease, so I felt confident that they understood the side effect profile. And it was an oral medication. So I went in once every 3 weeks to get a Rituxan infusion, and then I was given my pills from the specialist pharmacy at City of Hope. And so I took this pill every day, and I would go in. You know, I was going initially once a week for study visits, and then they started to space those visits out, and then they had imaged me. My disease had started to stabilize. So they said, okay, that's good. It looks like it's working. And then the disease had started to shrink. But unfortunately, at 10 months, they imaged me, and my disease was growing again. So at that point, I was thrown out of the trial because my disease had grown enough that they were no longer willing to have me participate in this trial. So they give up on you when you have growth in your disease. So then I was off again looking for treatment number 3. So now we're in late 2009, 2010, and there was a new chemo approved called bendamustine that had been developed in communist East Germany and was their gold plate treatment, like our CHOP was here. In Europe, in Eastern Europe, they use bendamustine. So I underwent more cycles of more chemotherapy starting at the end of 2009. I did monthly infusions of Rituxan and bendamustine, and it started to shrink the disease. But at the tail end, I still had disease. And so when we were figuring out what I would do next, because it was clear my disease was not going into remission, appeared to be already very refractory, so treatments weren't going to get rid of it. There was another newer treatment on the market that was a radioimmunotherapy that had been recently FDA approved. There were 2 of them. One was called Bexxar, which had been developed at the University of Michigan, and the other was called Zevalin. And I had spoken to a bunch of follicular patients through support groups, through the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, that had had Bexxar in the original trials in New York at Cornell Weill, and they were all still in remissions. And they were like me, heavily treated, not responding. So we decided to do Bexxar at that point because my disease wasn't going away. So in December of 2010, I'm now 4.5 years into my diagnosis, I go in and get Bexxar. Bexxar makes you radioactive for about 8 days. They no longer allowed you to do it in the hospital because the insurance companies refused to pay for it. So I had to get it at a doctor's office. Then I was told I had to go out the service elevator. They didn't want me exposed to any people in the regular elevator. And I thought, well, what about the people that are using the service elevator? They don't count. It was kind of crazy. Anyway, because I was radioactive after I got it. And there was a fertility clinic above my oncologist. And so there were people getting fertility treatments that were riding on the main elevator, and they didn't want anybody getting exposed to me. So I went home, I isolated for 8 days. I thought it's all worth it if this works. I felt very confident this was going to be different. It's going to work, because it worked entirely different than all the other treatments, and it was more targeted. So I thought, and I talked to so many patients that it worked. So I couldn't get scanned for 4 months because I was going to be radioactive for a while. And so the PET imaging would not be accurate. But in February of 2011, I was reading the paper and drinking my coffee one Sunday morning, and I was going like this, leaning on and I felt a whole chain of tumors down the back of my neck. So I knew, again, Bexxar had failed me. My 4th treatment had now failed me. So now I'm sitting 5 years into it. I've had 4 lines of treatment. The only thing left for me at that point was an allogeneic stem cell transplant, which is where you hopefully have a donor who's a sibling. You have a match. Ideally, you have an identical twin, because by definition, they're going to be a match. I only had 2 siblings, and neither one of them were a match. So I was told I would have to go into the unrelated donor banks, which we started to make those calls. But an allogeneic stem cell transplant is very, very risky. And what they do is they chemo you as if you were going to get an auto transplant. They chemo you, they wipe out your whole immune system, they get your cancer in a remission, and then on your allogeneic birthday, you are infused with a donor's stem cells. And you end up with that donor's immune system. And given how heavily treated I was, given how I didn't have a sibling match, I was at a very high risk of both mortality, where once they take your immune system down, you're very vulnerable to getting an infection. You could get a staph infection in the hospital. You could get pneumonia in the hospital. Now you get COVID, and your immune system, you have no protection. So it was really, really risky. And then having an unrelated donor, I was looking to terrible morbidity, what's called graft versus host disease, where your new immune system is infused into your body and grafts, hopefully gets rid of your lymphoma, but can also attack your organs. So it can attack your skin, which is the biggest organ in your body. It can attack your optic nerve. I met a woman who had an allo transplant. She was blind. It can attack your liver, your kidneys. You can end up having to get organ transplants. I mean, it's very, very risky. And at that point, I had a friend, I was convinced I was going to have to do that. And she said, no. I was so upset. I was depressed. I was at home. I'd taken my son to school. And then I went to bed. I was so upset. And I sent an email to my friends and family. I said, it's back. Bexxar didn't work. I'm going to bed. And one of my girlfriends, who is a doctor who had the same diagnosis, she called me. She said, Laurie, get up. Turn on your computer. We're finding you a trial. She came over that day. We researched 8 doctors. She said, you're not doing an allo. We're finding you another trial. And we sent emails to 8 doctors, 8 researchers all over the world. A guy doing vaccines in Spain, a researcher, a trial in Israel, a trial at Bayer, a trial at Memorial Sloan Kettering, a trial all over the place. And then we'd emailed a researcher at UCLA who had a couple trials I was interested in. So I went to bed. I was supposed to pick my son up that day at 3, and then we were going to a Lymphoma Research Foundation fundraiser, and I was helping my friend, actually the friend who came over to help me find trials, I was helping her set up for the event. So I went to bed, and an hour later, my phone rings, and I look at my caller ID, and it says UCLA. And I answered the phone, and this voice with a German accent said, look, Miss Adami, he mispronounced my name. This is Sven DeVos at UCLA. I need you to come in today. I have a trial that I think would work really well for you. It's a phase 1 trial. It's a PI3 kinase inhibitor. It's a pill. And I see you've already had a lot of bendamustine. I can't give you any more bendamustine. So you will be in the arm with patients getting Rituxan every 3 weeks, and you'll take this pill twice a day. He said, I only have 20 spots in the phase 1 trial. I already have 19 patients. So I only have room for one more. And if you don't come in today, one of my associates will probably give away the spot. I said, oh my gosh, Dr. DeVos, I have to go pick my son up at school. And then I'm going to this fundraiser I have to help set up. He said, are you by chance going to the Lymphoma Research Foundation fundraiser? I said, yes. Why? He said, I'm going to be there. I will bring the disclosures. I will get you to sign the releases. We'll lock you in today. And that's what happened. And I started that pill Rituxan combination May of 2011. I was patient number 20 in the phase 1 study at UCLA. And that drug immediately started to shrink my tumors. Never got rid of my disease, but I ended up being the longest patient, what they call the long tail, in this phase 1 trial of what was called Cal-101 at the time. It was a pill developed by Calistoga Pharmaceuticals that went on to get bought by Gilead, got approved very, very quickly because it was amazingly effective for refractory indolent lymphoma patients like me. And that drug, while it never put me in remission, I took it for 5.5 years. So when you looked at the study result and the academic papers, there was this little tail that kept going on, as a function of time. And that was me. I was actually the long tail. And it bought me a ton of time. And when I was on that trial in 2012, I attended a Leukemia Lymphoma Society event where they aired a film about CAR-T, which is chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy. And they showed Emily Whitehead's story. Emily Whitehead was a pediatric acute lymphoblastic leukemia patient at University of Pennsylvania. And she had this treatment called CAR-T, and it put her in a complete remission. And I had heard about this like the same year she had gotten CAR-T. And I'd never heard of CAR-T before. And I was seeing Dr. DeVos that week for my study visit for Cal-101 that had been renamed Zydelig after it was acquired by Gilead. It was renamed Zydelig. And so I was in to see my doctor at UCLA, and I said, Dr. DeVos, why haven't you told me about CAR-T? I was just blown away because what I learned was they would remove about 1 million of my T cells. And your T cells are part of your immune system, just like your NK cells and your B cells. And I had a B cell lymphoma. And what they would do is they remove your T cells, 1 million. They take it away to a lab where they grow those cells for about 3 weeks, and they combine it with a virus that they put a target on your cells so that when they reinfuse those cells into your body, they're like heat-seeking missiles. They recognize the CD19 protein that lived on my B cell malignant cancer cells. And they act like Pac-Man, and they run around and they destroy your cancer. And I said to Dr. DeVos, I said, I've never heard, everything I've gotten for treatments has come off a factory line. It's been a pill, it's been an infusion, one size fits all. This would actually use my own cells. So to me, this had to be smarter. And he said, well, actually, Laurie, I want you to come over here to the window because I want to show you a couple buildings. He said, you see those 2 white buildings over there? That's Kite Pharmaceutical. They're working on CAR-T, but we're not ready yet for follicular. They're working on more aggressive leukemias and more aggressive lymphomas. They haven't tackled yet indolent lymphomas, which is what follicular was, which I had. So he said, but right now you're riding on this horse. It's called Zydelig, and you're stable. And we're going to milk that as long as we can. You know, I'd figured out how to deal with the side effects from that drug, which were not insignificant. But I had aggressively figured out because I didn't want to go off that drug because it was the only thing that was holding me. And it was past a year now, and it was still working. And so he said, we're going to ride you on this, this horse. We'll ride it as long as we can, which ended up lasting me 5.5 years. So at the end of 2016, 5.5 years in, my tumor started to grow. And we knew the disease had finally outsmarted that pill. But it took 5.5 years for my cancer to figure out how to defeat this PI3 kinase inhibitor. But it started to grow back. And so at that point, there was a newly approved, sort of a third generation monoclonal antibody, third generation Rituxan, which was called, get this mouthful, obinutuzumab, which they shortened to be Gazyva. So this had been approved for follicular, for refractory disease. And I had a 9-month course. Once a month, I would go in. This was an infusion. And again, pretty immediately, I could feel the tumors starting to go away. So we knew, and this was again a CD20 monoclonal antibody. So it was targeting the CD20 that was still living on my tumors. And it shrunk my tumors. And, I was on that from January. I started January 2nd of 2017. I think I finished the course late September 2017. And we didn't image. There was no reason to image because I'd had so much imaging over the years that we were just palpating tumors and could feel things were much, much smaller. And so I went off, CAR-T still wasn't ready for trials. I was still aggressively watching all 3 manufacturers. It was Kite Pharma, it was Juno Therapeutics, and it was had come out of Penn, and it was Bristol Myers Squibb that had bought the University of Pennsylvania CAR-T. And I was reaching out, looking for trials. And unfortunately, as soon as I stopped the gazyva, my disease again blossomed. So I was now in a race against time. And I've just had my 6th therapy, and my cancer is growing out of control. We had to rebiopsy because they wanted to make sure it hadn't transformed. So I've been through more biopsies, bone marrow biopsies. I had something like 15 of them in my journey. I mean, I've been through so much at this point. And honestly, I was pretty much done. So I was just trying to maintain. My tumors were huge. And I was out walking in April of 2018. I now had my oncologist's cell phone number, and I saw him calling me from his cell phone. I no longer saw the UCLA caller ID. I saw Sven DeVos, and he said, I have great news. The CAR-T trial from Kite Pharmaceutical is opening. We will have 5 slots at UCLA. You will be patient number 1. I need you to come in. We need to get you going. You need to sign the trial paperwork, start all the imaging, the biopsies, preparation to proceed in this trial. So now, fast forward, I'm now in 2018. When I started, I was in 2006. I'm now 12 years into it. Pretty much to the day, 12 years.
And so now you are on to phase 7 of your treatment now. But it sounds like the 7th time was a charm.
It was. And by this point, my son was a senior in high school. So remember when he was diagnosed, I was in kindergarten. He spent his entire elementary, middle, high school with a mom in treatment because I was in treatment outside of a short time in the beginning when I was watching it come back. I was in treatment the entire time, and I just went from treatment to treatment. So here he is getting ready for his graduation. My family's all coming out from New England to celebrate. I'm having a big party, and I have tumors like blocking my face. They were so huge. And I was so sick at the end, and I was really done. I mean, if I hadn't gotten CAR-T when I did, the only other option at this point was to do an allogeneic stem cell transplant, which for all the reasons I explained before was going to be a death. I mean, my Dr. DeVos said that because of my treatment history, my weakened immune, the whole 9 yards, he said I had a 1 in 3 chance I would survive allotransplant. I had a 1 in 3 chance I would get a complete remission. My lymphoma would go away. And I had a 1 in 3 chance that I wouldn't get awful graft versus host disease. So these were terrible odds. And we didn't know about CAR-T. We didn't have enough data, but we knew it was at least a 50% chance I would get in remission. I understood the risks going in, that a patient can develop cytokine release syndrome, or CRS, and a patient can develop what's called ICANS, which stands for neurotoxicity. But really, it was my best and only shot at that point.
But you did eventually get to a stage in which you were declared NED, yes?
Yes. So July 16th, 2018, I got my CAR-T cells back. I had had them harvested. I'd had my T cells harvested mid-June. They were gone to the facility, which is actually in El Segundo down the road. And I actually had the pleasure to visit the site and meet people who worked on my cells in June of 2018, which was really an incredible experience. So July 16th, July 15th, 2018, I checked into the Ronald Reagan UCLA Westwood Hospital. And the next day, July 16th, I received my CAR-T cells back. And they brought in this little bag. Remember, they'd removed 1 million cells. When they brought it back, there were actually 1 billion CAR-T cells. That's how much they grow it in the lab. From 1 million to 1 billion, then they infused it, and then as soon as it hit my bloodstream, and I had the doctor estimated I had 8 pounds of tumor burden on my treatment day, 8 pounds. And the before scan is unreal. It's everywhere. The cancer's in my bone marrow. It's in my head and neck. It's in my groin. I had a huge tumor again in my abdomen that was pushing on my right kidney. And my kidney enzymes were all messed up. They were going to have to put a stent in my kidney if the CAR-T cells didn't work rapidly. So I get my CAR-T cells back, just hoping that it was going to work. 2 days later, my kidney enzymes were normal. That's how fast it worked. And on day 29, after getting my CAR-T cells, I was wheeled into the PET scan machine at UCLA, Ronald Reagan Hospital. And that day, my oncologist came to see me and said, Laurie, actually that day he called me before he came to see me. He called me on my hospital phone. He said, Laurie, you're in a complete remission. I had never heard those words since those dirty scans in the beginning, because we now know after R-CHOP, I was not in a molecular remission. There was still circulating tumors in my system, but I was now confirmed to be in complete remission. And I went, because I was in a trial, and it was a phase 2 trial of Yescarta. That was the name of the kite product that I got. The CAR-T product was called Yescarta. It was a phase 2 trial, so there was an imaging study that went after. So you got to scan it 30 days, 90 days, I think 120 days, 180 days, 9 months, a year. Then they took you to 18-month imaging, then 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And I just had my 7-year anniversary of getting my CAR-T cells, July 16th, 2025. And I am still in complete remission, and now actually considered cured, even though follicular is still called incurable. The sense is that CAR-T may actually cure around 2/3 of us, which is, you never hear those kind of numbers. And it's because it uses our own immune systems. And our cells are made smarter, and they're reinfused into us, and they do their magic. I still have CAR-T cells circulating, and I'm 7 years out. So I still have patrollers checking to make sure nothing's going awry. So that is my story.
Laurie, and that's a tremendous story. You've overcome so much. We're about to wrap up now, but I do want to ask this question. Many times we conclude our interviews by asking the guest, if you had a private audience with somebody who was diagnosed with your kind of cancer, what would you say to them? But I want to put a finer point on this. What would your advice be for someone with non-Hodgkin lymphoma or almost any kind of cancer if they went through something similar that you did, in which you got on some treatment regimen and it didn't work, and another and it didn't work, and this is a tremendous mental and emotional setback, and physical. For those people who have to go through these multiple steps, your advice to them would be what?
I think for me, going through this, it was a roller coaster. And I never really had a break. I would get encouraged because during treatment, it would fail. I had depression during my time. I used medication to help me with that. I also had a big motivator in my little boy. And he was in kindergarten when I was diagnosed, and I just couldn't fathom the idea of my husband saying to him, "Mommy died." So I had this big motivator. Try to find something that motivates you, that gives you purpose to keep fighting. Now, I went through 7 lines of treatment to get CAR-T. Most people don't. Now it's actually already FDA approved. Because the results were so great, it's now approved for follicular as 3rd line. You don't have to go through as many. And for aggressive lymphoma, it's approved as 2nd line. So at first relapse. And it's going to come sooner because it works so much better than the chemo and all the other things we get. So I would say find your motivator and recognize you're going to go through it. People are going to say to you, be positive. Well, ask them, when did you get cancer and how positive did you feel? Try to talk to another patient. Another patient who's been on the road ahead of you will give you hope that you can survive too. And you need hope. You also need to see specialists. You cannot see a general oncologist. They don't know enough. You need to see a lymphoma specialist who's a hematology, oncology, cancer specialist. Not just a hematology, because there's lots of blood disorders. You really need to see specialists. So I'm sorry, I have a lot of advice, and I can't tell you any one thing, but I would say it was a combination of those things. I was also fortunate. I lived in Los Angeles. I could get to all these great NCI designated cancer research centers, either an hour driving, an hour on a plane. So I could consult with so many and get many, many opinions. And I always encourage patients to get more than one. Have your pathology confirmed. There's now over 100 subtypes of lymphoma, believe it or not. When I was diagnosed, they designated 25. Now there's 100 because they recognize all these disparities in the genetics. And that can impact, that correct diagnosis can impact your treatment. So make sure you get a good pathologist looking at your studies. And, that's kind of it, Bruce. I mean, I'm in the process now of writing a memoir, and so I'm hoping to put more of this into writing to help other patients. But I think the most important thing is find that motivator, get to a specialist, and find another patient who's ahead of you on the road that can give you the hope that you can be like them and be a survivor.
Wow, a compelling story and compelling advice as well. Laurie Adami of Los Angeles, thank you so much for being with us on Cancer Interviews. This is a story that I have no doubt will resonate with lots of people. Thanks again, Laurie.
You're very welcome, Bruce. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share my story. Take care. Enjoy your summer.
And we want to remind you, as we always do when we wrap up, that if you are on a cancer journey, you are not alone. There are people out there like Laurie Adami who have tons of advice that can be of help. All you have to do is listen. So until next time, we'll see you on down the road.